Hi, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. Today we're continuing reading from Oliver Twist, starting with chapter 27, Atones for the unpoliteness of a former chapter which deserted a lady most unceremoniously. As it would be by no means seemly in a humble author to keep so mighty a personage as a beetle waiting, with his back to the fire and the skirts of his coat gathered up under his arms, until such time as it might suit his pleasure to relieve him, and as it would still less become his station, or his gallantry, to involve in the same neglect a lady on whom that beetle had looked with an eye of tenderness and affection, and in whose ear he had whispered sweet words, which, coming from such a quarter, might well thrill the bosom of maid or matron of whatsoever degree. The historian whose pen traces these words, trusting that he knows his place, and that he entertains a becoming reverence for those upon earth to whom high and important authority is delegated, hastens to pay them that respect which their position demands, and to treat them with all that duteous ceremony which their exalted rank and by consequences great virtues imperatively claim at his hands. Toward this end, indeed, he had proposed to introduce, in this place, a dissertation touching the divine right of beetles, and elucidative of the position that a beetle can do no wrong, which could not fail to have been both pleasurable and profitable to the right-handed reader, but which he is unfortunately compelled by want of time and space to postpone to some more convenient and fitting opportunity, on the arrival of which he will be prepared to show that a beetle properly constituted, that is to say, a parochial beetle attached to a parochial workhouse and attending in his official capacity the parochial church, is, in right and virtue of his office, possessed of all the excellences and best qualities of humanity, and that to none of those excellences can mere company's beetles or court of law beetles or even chapel of ease beetles, save the last, and they in a very lowly and inferior degree, lay the remotest sustainable claim. Mr. Bumble had recounted the teaspoons, reweighed the sugar tongs, made a closer inspection of the milk pot, and ascertained to a nicety the exact condition of the furniture, down to the very horsehair seats of the chairs, and had repeated each process full half a dozen times before he began to think that it was time for Mrs. Corney to return. Thinking begets thinking, and as there were no sounds of Mrs. Corney's approach, it occurred to Mr. Bumble that it would be an innocent and virtuous way of spending the time, if he were further to allay his curiosity by a cursory glance at the interior of Mrs. Corney's chest of drawers. Having listened at the keyhole to assure himself that nobody was approaching the chamber, Mr. Bumble, beginning at the bottom, proceeded to make himself acquainted with the contents of the 3 long drawers, which, being filled with various garments of good fashion and texture, carefully preserved between 2 layers of old newspapers, speckled with dried lavender, seemed to yield him exceeding satisfaction. Arriving, in course of time, at the right-hand corner drawer in which was the key, and beholding therein a small padlocked box, which being shaken gave forth a pleasant sound, as of the chinking of coin, Mr. Bumble returned with a stately walk to the fireplace, and resuming his old attitude, said with a grave and determined air, "I'll do it." He followed up this remarkable declaration by shaking his head in a waggish manner for 10 minutes, as though he were remonstrating with himself for being such a pleasant dog, and then he took a view of his legs in profile, with much seeming pleasure and interest. He was still placidly engaged in this latter survey when Mrs. Corney, hurrying into the room, threw herself in a breathless state on a chair by the fireside, and covering her eyes with one hand, placed the other over her heart and gasped for breath. "Mrs. Corney," said Mr. Bumble, stooping over the matron. "What is this, ma'am? Has anything happened, ma'am? Pray answer me. I'm on—" Mr. Bumble, in his alarm, could not immediately think of the word tenterhooks, so he said, "Broken bottles." "Oh, Mr. Bumble," cried the lady, "I've been so dreadfully put out." "Put out, ma'am?" exclaimed Mr. Bumble. "Who has dared to—" "I know," said Mr. Bumble, checking himself with native majesty. "This is them vicious paupers." "It's dreadful to think of," said the lady, shuddering. "Then don't think of it, ma'am," rejoined Mr. Bumble. "I can't help it," whimpered the lady. "Then take something, ma'am," said Mr. Bumble soothingly. "A little of the wine?" "Not for the world," replied Mrs. Corney. "I couldn't. Oh, the top shelf in the right-hand corner. Oh!" Uttering these words, the good lady pointed distractedly to the cupboard and underwent a convulsion from internal spasms. Mr. Bumble rushed to the closet, and snatching a pint green glass bottle from the shelf, thus incoherently indicated, filled a teacup with its contents, and held it to the lady's lips. "I'm better now," said Mrs. Corney, falling back after drinking half of it. Mr. Bumble raised his eyes piously to the ceiling in thankfulness, and bringing them down again to the brim of the cup, lifted it to his nose. "Peppermint!" exclaimed Mrs. Corney in a faint voice, smiling gently on the beetle as she spoke. "Try it. There's a little something else in it." Mr. Bumble tasted the medicine with a doubtful look, smacked his lips, took another taste, and put the cup down empty. "It's very comforting," said Mrs. Corney. "Very much so indeed, ma'am," said the beetle. As he spoke, he drew a chair beside the matron and tenderly inquired what had happened to distress her. "Nothing," replied Mrs. Corney. "I am a foolish, excitable, weak creature." "Not weak, ma'am," retorted Mr. Bumble, drawing his chair a little closer. "Are you a weak creature, Mrs. Corney?" "We are all weak creatures," said Mrs. Corney, laying down a general principle. "So we are," said the beetle. Nothing was said on either side for a minute or two afterwards. By the expiration of that time, Mr. Bumble had illustrated the position by removing his left arm from the back of Mrs. Corney's chair, where it had previously rested, to Mrs. Corney's apron string, round which it gradually became entwined. "We are all weak creatures," said Mr. Bumble. Mrs. Corney sighed. "Don't sigh, Mrs. Corney," said Mr. Bumble. "I can't help it," said Mrs. Corney, and she sighed again. "This is a very comfortable room, ma'am," said Mr. Bumble, looking around. "Another room in this, ma'am, would be a complete thing." "It would be too much for one," murmured the lady. "But not for two, ma'am," rejoined Mr. Bumble in soft accents. "Eh, Mrs. Corney?" Mrs. Corney drooped her head when the beetle said this. The beetle drooped his to get a view of Mrs. Corney's face. Mrs. Corney, with great propriety, turned her head away and released her hand to get at her pocket handkerchief, but insensibly replaced it in that of Mr. Bumble. "The board allows you coals, don't they, Mrs. Corney?" inquired the beetle, affectionately pressing her hand. "And candles," replied Mrs. Corney, slightly returning the pressure. "Coals, candles, and house rent-free," said Mr. Bumble. "Oh, Mrs. Corney, what an angel you are!" The lady was not proof against this burst of feeling. She sank into Mr. Bumble's arms, and that gentleman, in his agitation, imprinted a passionate kiss upon her chaste nose. "Such parochial perfection!" exclaimed Mr. Bumble rapturously. "You know that Mr. Slout is worse tonight, my fascinator?" "Yes," replied Mrs. Corney bashfully. "He can't live a week, the doctor says," pursued Mr. Bumble. "He is the master of this establishment. His death will cause a vacancy. That vacancy must be filled up. Oh, Mrs. Corney, what a prospect this opens! What an opportunity for a joining of hearts and housekeepings!" Mrs. Corney sobbed. "The little word," said Mr. Bumble, bending over the bashful beauty. "The one little word, my blessed Corney?" Yes," sighed out the matron. "One more," pursued the beetle. "Compose your darling feelings for only one more. When is it to come off?" Mrs. Corney twice essayed to speak and twice failed. At length, summoning up courage, she threw her arms round Mr. Bumble's neck and said it might be as soon as ever he pleased, and that he was an irresistible duck. Matters being thus amicably and satisfactorily arranged, the contract was solemnly ratified in another teacupful of the peppermint mixture, which was rendered the more necessary by the flutter and agitation of the lady's spirits. While it was being disposed of, she acquainted Mr. Bumble with the old woman's decease. "Very good," said that gentleman, sipping his peppermint. "I'll call it sourberries as I go home and tell him to send tomorrow morning. Was it that as frightened you, love?" "It wasn't anything particular, dear," said the lady evasively. "It must have been something, love," urged Mr. Bumble. "Won't you tell your own bee?" "Not now," rejoined the lady. "One of these days, after we're married, dear." "After we're married!" exclaimed Mr. Bumble. "It wasn't any impudence from any of them male paupers as—" "No, no, love," interposed the lady hastily. "If I thought it was," continued Mr. Bumble, "if I thought as any one of 'em had dared to lift his vulgar eyes to that lovely countenance—" "They wouldn't have dared to do it, love," responded the lady. "They had better not," said Mr. Bumble, clenching his fist. "Let me see any man, parochial or extra-parochial, as would presume to do it, and I can tell him that he wouldn't do it a second time." Unembellished by any violence of gesticulation, this might have seemed no very high compliment to the lady's charms, but as Mr. Bumble accompanied the threat with many warlike gestures, she was much touched with this proof of his devotion, and protested with great admiration that he was indeed a dove. The dove then turned up his coat collar and put on his cocked hat, and having exchanged a long and affectionate embrace with his future partner, once again braved the cold wind of the night, merely pausing for a few minutes in the male paupers' ward to abuse them a little with a view of satisfying himself that he could fill the office of workhouse master with needful acerbity. Assured of his qualifications, Mr. Bumble left the building with a light heart and bright visions of his future promotion, which served to occupy his mind until he reached the shop of the undertaker. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Sowerberry having gone out to tea and supper, and Noah Claypole not being at any time disposed to take upon himself a greater amount of physical exertion than is necessary to a convenient performance of the two functions of eating and drinking, the shop was not closed, although it was past the usual hour of shutting up. Mr. Bumble tapped with his cane on the counter several times, but attracting no attention, and beholding a light shining through the glass window of the little parlor at the back of the shop, he made bold to peep in and see what was going forward. And when he saw what was going forward, he was not a little surprised. The cloth was laid for supper, and the table was covered with bread and butter, plates and glasses, a porter pot, and a wine bottle. At the upper end of the table, Mr. Noah Claypole lolled negligently in an easy-chair with his legs thrown over one of the arms, an open-clasped knife in one hand and a mass of buttered bread in the other. Close beside him stood Charlotte, opening oysters from a barrel, which Mr. Claypole condescended to swallow with remarkable avidity. A more than ordinary redness in the region of the young gentleman's nose, and a kind of fixed wink in his right eye, denoted that he was in a slight degree intoxicated, and these symptoms were confirmed by the intense relish with which he took his oysters, for which nothing but a strong appreciation of their cooling properties in cases of internal fever could have sufficiently accounted. "Here's a delicious fat one, Noah dear," said Charlotte. "Try 'em, do. Only this one." "What a delicious thing is an oyster," remarked Mr. Claypole after he had swallowed it. "What a pity it is a number of 'em should ever make you feel uncomfortable, isn't it, Charlotte?" "It's quite a cruelty," said Charlotte. "So it is," acquiesced Mr. Claypole. "Ain't you fond of oysters?" "Not overmuch," replied Charlotte. "I like to see you eat them, Noah, dear, better than eating 'em myself." "Lord," said Noah reflectively, "how queer." "Have another," said Charlotte. "Here's one with such a beautiful, delicate beard." "I can't manage any more," said Noah. "I'm very sorry. Come here, Charlotte, and I'll kiss you." "What?" said Mr. Bumble, bursting into the room. "Say that again, sir." Charlotte uttered a scream and hid her face in her apron. Mr. Claypole, without making any further change in his position than suffering his legs to reach the ground, gazed at the beetle in drunken terror. "Say it again, you vile, audacious fellow," said Mr. Bumble. "How dare you mention such a thing, sir? How dare you encourage him, you insolent minx?" "Kiss her," exclaimed Mr. Bumble in strong indignation. "Faugh!" "I didn't mean to do it," said Noah, blubbering. "She's always a kissing of me, whether I like it or not." "Oh, Noah!" cried Charlotte reproachfully. "You are, retorted Noah. "She's always a-doing of it, Mr. Bumble, sir. She chucks me under the chin, please, sir, and makes all manner of love." "Silence!" cried Mr. Bumble sternly. "Take yourselves downstairs, ma'am. Noah, you shut up the shop. Say another word till your master comes home at your peril. And when he does come home, tell him that Mr. Bumble said he was to send an old woman's shell after breakfast tomorrow morning. Do you hear, sir?" "Kissing!" cried Mr. Bumble, holding up his hands. "The sin and wickedness of the lower orders in this parochial district is frightful. If Parliament don't take their abominable courses under consideration, this country's ruined, and the character of the peasantry gone forever." With these words, the beetle strode with a lofty and gloomy air from the undertaker's premises. "And now that we have accompanied him so far in his road home, and have made all necessary preparations for the old woman's funeral, let us set on foot a few inquiries after young Oliver Twist, and ascertain whether he be still lying in the ditch where Toby Crackit left him. Chapter 28. Looks after Oliver and proceeds with his adventures. "Wolves tear your throats," muttered Sikes, grinding his teeth. "I wish I was among some of you. You'd howl the hoarser for it." As Sikes growled forth this imprecation, with the most desperate ferocity that his desperate nature was capable of, he rested the body of the wounded boy across his bended knee and turned his head for an instant to look back at his pursuers. There was little to be made out in the mist and darkness, but the loud shouting of men vibrated through the air, and the barking of the neighboring dogs, roused by the sound of the alarm bell, resounded in every direction. "Stop, you white-livered hound," cried the robber, shouting after Toby Crackit, who, making the best use of his long legs, was already ahead. "Stop!" The repetition of the word brought Toby to a dead standstill, for he was not quite satisfied that he was beyond the range of pistol shot, and Sikes was in no mood to be played with. "Bear a hand with the boy," roared Sikes, beckoning furiously to his confederate. "Come back." Toby made a show of returning, but ventured, in a low voice, broken for want of breath, to intimate considerable reluctance as he came slowly along. "Quicker!" cried Sikes, laying the boy in a dry ditch at his feet, and drawing a pistol from his pocket. "Don't play booty with me." At this moment the noise grew louder. Sikes, again looking round, could discern that the men who had given chase were already climbing the gate of the field in which he stood, and that a couple of dogs were some paces in advance of them. "It's all up, Bill," cried Toby. "Drop the kid and show him your heels." With this parting advice, Mr. Crackit, preferring the chance of being shot by his friend to the certainty of being taken by his enemies, fairly turned tail and darted off at full speed. Sikes clenched his teeth, took one look round, threw over the prostrate prostrate form of Oliver, the cape in which he had been hurriedly muffled, ran along the front of the hedge as if to distract the attention of those behind from the spot where the boy lay, paused for a second before another hedge which met it at right angles, and whirling his pistol high into the air, cleared it at a bound and was gone. "Ho, ho, there!" cried a tremulous voice in the rear. "Pincher! Neptune! Come here! Come here!" The dogs, who in common with their masters seemed to have no particular relish for the sport in which they were engaged, readily answered to the command, and 3 men, who had by this time advanced some distance into the field, stopped to take counsel together. "My advice, or leastways I should say my orders, is," said the fattest man of the party, "that we immediately go home again." "I am agreeable to anything which is agreeable to Mr. Giles," said a shorter man, who was by no means of a slim figure, and who was very pale in the face and very polite, as frightened men frequently are. "I shouldn't wish to appear ill-mannered, gentlemen," said the third, who had called the dogs back. "Mr. Giles ought to know." "Certainly," replied the shorter man, "and whatever Mr. Giles says, it isn't our place to contradict him." No, I know my situation. Thank my stars, I know my situation." To tell the truth, the little man did seem to know his situation, and to know perfectly well that it was by no means a desirable one, for his teeth chattered in his head as he spoke. "You are afraid, Brittles," said Mr. Giles. "I ain't," said Brittles. "You are," said Giles. "You're a falsehood, Mr. Giles," said Brittles. "You're a lie, Brittles," said Mr. Giles. Now these 4 retorts arose from Mr. Giles' taunt, and Mr. Giles' taunt had arisen from his indignation at having the responsibility of going home again imposed upon himself under cover of a compliment. The third man brought the dispute to a close most philosophically. "I'll tell you what it is, gentlemen," said he. "We're all afraid." "Speak for yourself, sir," said Mr. Giles, who was the palest of the party. "So I do," replied the man. "It's natural and proper to be afraid under such circumstances. I am." "So am I," said Brittles, "only there's no call to tell a man he is so bounceably." These frank admissions softened Mr. Giles, who at once owned that he was afraid, upon which they all 3 faced about and ran back again with the completest unanimity, until Mr. Giles, who had the shortest wind of the party and was encumbered with a pitchfork, most handsomely insisted on stopping to make an apology for his hastiness of speech. "But it's wonderful," said Mr. Giles, when he had explained, "what a man will do when his blood is up. I should have committed murder, I know I should, if we'd caught one of the rascals." As the other 2 were impressed with a similar presentiment, and as their blood, like his, had all gone down again, some speculation ensued upon the cause of this sudden change in their temperament. "I know what it was," said Mr. Giles. "It was the gate." "I shouldn't wonder if it was," exclaimed Brittles, catching at the idea. "You may depend upon it," said Giles, "that the gate stopped the flow of the excitement. I felt all mine suddenly going away as I was climbing over it." By a remarkable coincidence, the other 2 had been visited with the same unpleasant sensation at that precise moment. It was quite obvious, therefore, that it was the gate, especially as there was no doubt regarding the time at which the change had taken place, because all 3 remembered that they had come in sight of the robbers at the very instant of its occurrence. This dialogue was held between the 2 men who had surprised the burglars and a traveling tinker who had been sleeping in an outhouse and who had been roused, together with his 2 mongrel curs, to join in the pursuit. Mr. Giles acted in the double capacity of butler and steward to the old lady of the mansion, and Brittles was a lad of all work, who, having entered her service a mere child, was treated as a promising young boy still, though he was something past 30. Encouraging each other with such converse as this, but keeping very close together notwithstanding, and looking apprehensively round whenever a fresh gust rattled through the boughs, the 3 men hurried back to a tree, which behind which they had left their lantern, lest its light should inform the thieves in what direction to fire. Catching up to light, they made the best of their way home in a good round trot, and long after their dusky forms had ceased to be discernible, it might have been seen twinkling and dancing in the distance, like some exhalation of the damp and gloomy atmosphere through which it was swiftly borne. The air grew colder as day came slowly on, and the mist rolled along the ground like a dense cloud of smoke. The grass was wet, the pathways and low places were all mire and water, and the damp breath of an unwholesome wind went languidly by with a hollow moaning. Still, Oliver lay motionless and insensible on the spot where Sikes had left him. Morning drew on apace. The air became more sharp and piercing as its first dull hue, the death of night rather than the birth of day, glimmered faintly in the sky. The objects, which had looked dim and terrible in the darkness, grew more and more defined and gradually resolved into their familiar shapes. The rain came down thick and fast and pattered noisily among the leafless bushes. But Oliver felt it not as it beat against him, for he still lay stretched, helpless and unconscious, on his bed of clay. At length a low cry of pain broke the stillness that prevailed, and uttering it, the boy awoke. His left arm, rudely bandaged in a shawl, hung heavy and useless at his side, and the bandage was saturated with blood. He was so weak that he could scarcely raise himself into a sitting posture, and when he had done so, he looked feebly round for help and groaned with pain. Trembling in every joint from cold and exhaustion, he made an effort to stand upright, but shuddering from head to foot, fell prostrate on the ground. After a short return of the stupor in which he had been so long plunged, Oliver, urged by a creeping sickness at his heart which seemed to warn him that if he lay there he must surely die, got upon his feet and essayed to walk. His head was dizzy, and he staggered to and fro like a drunken man, but he kept up, nevertheless, and with his head drooping languidly on his breast, went stumbling onward, he knew not whither. And now hosts of bewildering and confused ideas came crowding on his mind. He seemed to be still walking between Sikes and Crackit, who were angrily disputing, for the very words they said sounded in his ears, and when he caught his own attention, as it were, by making some violent effort to save himself from falling, he found that he was talking to them. Then he was alone with Sikes, plodding on as they had done the previous day, and as shadowy people passed them, he felt the robber's grasp upon his wrist. Suddenly, he started back at the report of firearms, and there rose into the air loud cries and shouts. Lights gleamed before his eyes, and all was noise and tumult, as some unseen hand bore him hurriedly away. Through all these rapid visions there ran an undefined, uneasy consciousness of pain, which wearied and tormented him incessantly. Thus he staggered on, creeping, almost mechanically, between the bars of gates or through hedge gaps as they came in his way, until he reached a road. Here the rain began to fall so heavily that it roused him. He looked about and saw that at no great distance there was a house which perhaps he could reach. Pitying his condition, they might have compassion on him, and if they did not, it would be better, he thought, to die near human beings than in the lonely open fields. He summoned up all his strength for one last trial, and bent his faltering steps toward it. As he drew nearer to the house, a feeling came over him that he had seen it before. He remembered nothing of its details, but the shape and aspect of the building seemed familiar to him. That garden wall. On the grass inside he had fallen on his knees last night and prayed the two men's mercy. It was the very same house they had attempted to rob. Oliver felt such fear come over him when he recognized the place that for the instant he forgot the agony of his wound and thought only of flight. Flight! He could scarcely stand, and if he were in full possession of all the best powers of his slight and youthful frame, whither could he fly? He pushed against the garden gate. It was unlocked and swung open on its hinges. He tottered across the lawn, climbed the steps, knocked faintly at the door, and his whole strength failing him, sunk down against one of the pillars of the little portico. It happened that about this time Mr. Giles, Brittle, and the tinker were recruiting themselves after the fatigues and terrors of the night with tea and sundries in the kitchen. Not that it was Mr. Giles' habit to admit to too great familiarity with the humbler servants, toward whom it was rather his wont to deport himself with a lofty affability, which, while it gratified, could not fail to remind them of his superior position in society. But death, fires, and burglary made all men equals. So Mr. Giles sat with his legs stretched out before the kitchen fender, leaning his left arm on the table, while with his right he illustrated a circumstantial and minute account of the robbery, to which his hearers, but especially the cook and housemaid who were of the party, listened with breathless interest. "It was about 2:30, said Mr. Giles, or I wouldn't swear that it mightn't have been a little nearer 3, when I woke up, and turning round in my bed, as it might be so," here Mr. Giles turned round in his chair and pulled the corner of the tablecloth over him to intimate bedclothes, "I fancied I heard a noise." At this point of the narrative, the cook turned pale and asked the housemaid to shut the door, who asked Brittles, who asked the tinker, who pretended not to hear. "Heard a noise," continued Mr. Giles. "I says at first, this is illusion, and was composing myself off to sleep, when I heard the noise again distinct." "What sort of noise?" asked the cook. "A kind of a busting noise," replied Mr. Giles, looking round him. "More like the noise of powdering an iron bar on a nutmeg grater," suggested Brittles. "It was when you heard, sir," rejoined Mr. Giles, "but at this time it had a busting sound. I turned down the clothes," continued Mr. Giles, rolling back the tablecloth, "sat up in bed and listened. The cook and the housemaid simultaneously said, 'Lord,' and drew their chairs closer together. I heard it now, quite apparent," resumed Mr. Giles. "Somebody," I says, "is forcing off a door or window. What's to be done? I'll call up that poor lad Brittles and save him from being murdered in his bed, or his throat," I says, "may be cut from his right ear to his left without his ever knowing it." Here all eyes were turned upon Brittles, who fixed his upon the speaker and stared at him with his mouth wide open and his face expressive of the most unmitigated horror. "I tossed off the clothes," said Giles, throwing away the tablecloth and looking very hard at the cook and housemaid, "got softly out of bed, drew on a pair of ladies present, Mr. Giles, murmured the tinker. Of shoes, sir, said Giles, turning upon him, and laying great emphasis on the word, seized the loaded pistol that always goes upstairs with the plate basket, and walked on tiptoes to his room. Brittles, I says, when I had woke him, don't be frightened. So you did, observed Brittles in a low voice. We're dead men, I think, Brittles, I says, continued Giles, but don't be frightened. Was he frightened? Asked the cook. Not a bit of it, replied Mr. Giles. He was as firm, pretty near as firm as I was. I should have died at once, I'm sure, if it had been me, observed the housemaid. You're a woman, retorted Brittles, plucking up a little. Brittles is right, said Mr. Giles, nodding his head approvingly. From a woman, nothing else was to be expected. We, being men, took a dark lantern that was standing on Brittles' hob and groped our way downstairs in the pitch dark, as it might be so. Mr. Giles had risen from his seat and taken 2 steps with his eyes shut to accompany his description with appropriate action, when he started violently, in common with the rest of the company, and hurried back to his chair. The cook and the housemaid screamed. It was a knock, said Mr. Giles, assuming perfect serenity. Open the door, somebody. Nobody moved. It seems a strange sort of thing, a knock coming at such a time in the morning, said Mr. Giles, surveying the pale faces which surrounded him, and looking very blank himself. But the door must be opened. Do you hear somebody? Mr. Giles, as he spoke, looked at Brittles, but that young man, being naturally modest, probably considered himself nobody, and so held that the inquiry could not have any application to him. At all events, he tendered no reply. Mr. Giles directed an appealing glance at the tinker, but he had suddenly fallen asleep. The women were out of the question. If Brittles would rather open the door in presence of witnesses, said Mr. Giles after a short silence, I am ready to make one. So am I, said the tinker, waking up as suddenly as he had fallen asleep. Brittles capitulated on these terms, and the party, being somewhat reassured by the discovery made on throwing open the shutters that it was now broad day, took their way upstairs with the dogs in front and the 2 women, who were afraid to stay below, bringing up the rear. By the advice of Mr. Giles, they all talked very loud to warn any evil-disposed person outside that they were strong in numbers, and by a master stroke of policy, originating in the brain of the same ingenious gentleman, the dogs' tails were well pinched in the hall to make them bark savagely. These precautions having been taken, Mr. Giles held on fast by the tinker's arm to prevent his running away, as he pleasantly said, and gave the word of command to open the door. Brittles obeyed, and the group, peering timorously over each other's shoulders, beheld no more formidable object than poor little Oliver Twist, speechless and exhausted, who raised his heavy eyes and mutely solicited their compassion. A boy, exclaimed Mr. Giles, valiantly pushing the tinker into the background. What's the matter with why, Brittles, look here. Don't you know? Brittles, who had got behind the door to open it, no sooner saw Oliver than he uttered a loud cry. Mr. Giles, seizing the boy by one leg and one arm, fortunately not the broken limb, lugged him straight into the hall and deposited him at full length on the floor thereof. Here he is, bawled Giles, calling in a state of great excitement up the staircase. Here's one of the thieves, ma'am. Here's a thief, miss. Wounded him. Wounded, miss. I shot him, miss, and Brittles held the light. In a lantern, miss, cried Brittles, applying one hand to the side of his mouth so that his voice might travel the better. The 2 women servants ran upstairs to carry the intelligence that Mr. Giles had captured a robber, and the tinker busied himself in endeavoring to restore Oliver, lest he should die before he could be hanged. In the midst of all this noise and commotion, there was heard a sweet female voice which quelled it in an instant. Giles, whispered the voice from the stairhead. I'm here, miss, replied Mr. Giles. Don't be frightened, miss. I ain't much injured. He didn't make a very desperate resistance, miss. I was soon too many for him. Hush, replied the young lady. You frightened my aunt as much as the thieves did. Is the poor creature much hurt? Wounded desperate, miss, replied Giles with indescribable complacency. He looks as if he was a-going, miss, bawled Brittles in the same manner as before. Wouldn't you like to come and look at him, miss, in case he should? Hush, pray, there's a good man, rejoined the young lady. Wait quietly one instant while I speak to aunt. With a footstep as soft and gentle as the voice, the speaker tripped away and soon returned with the direction that the wounded person was to be carried carefully upstairs to Mr. Giles' room, and that Brittles was to saddle the pony and betake himself instantly to Chertsey, from which place he was to dispatch with all speed a constable and a doctor. But won't you take one look at him first, miss? Asked Mr. Giles with as much pride as if Oliver were some bird of rare plumage that he had skillfully brought down. Not one little peep, miss? Not now for the world, replied the young lady. Poor fellow. Oh, treat him kindly, Giles, for my sake. The old servant looked up at the speaker as she turned away with a glance as proud and admiring as if she had been his own child. Then, bending over Oliver, he helped to carry him upstairs with the care and solicitude of a woman. We'll stop there and start next time with Chapter 29. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.